Part 10. The Nightclub. James arrived at Chevalier's at 8 on Monday morning. He needed to peruse the register of stockholders that Vincent had promised would be with him first thing. Since the company was registered on the New York Stock Exchange, the company registrars were also in New York City. James walked down the corridor towards his office and automatically turned to look towards Angela's office. The door was ajar, so he walked across to surprise her. "Hi, Gorgeous," he called as he threw open the door. "There's no Gorgeous in here," replied John, rising from Angela's chair. "Unless you think I'm gorgeous, that is," he continued. James blushed, but quickly regained his composure. "She's not in yet," said John, and added, "I came in this morning and my terminal was down, so I've borrowed Angie's. I won't be long. Sit down. We can talk shop if you like." James was irked by John's obvious familiarity with Angela and sat down. "Having trouble with her yet?" asked John, teasing James. "I don't know what you mean," said James. "You will, my dear fellow. Finished. That's all I need. I'm done." James watched John closely as John slid across the carpet, still seated on his chair. "That's better. We can see each other properly now. What are you up to tonight? Fancy a nightclub and some proper women?" James was almost apoplectic and fought desperately to stop himself from grabbing John by the throat. "Not really my scene, but since you ask, it would be a pleasure to go with you." "Can I bring a guest?" said James, pointedly. "Sure, no problem. Dinner for 3 then. Say, 8:30 at Caesar's. You know where that is, don't you?" asked John, grinning. "Yes, 8:30. Good," replied James. John hopped off out of his chair like a boxer ready to fight the next round, and in an instant he was gone. James wandered out into the hallway, still dissecting his meeting with John, and headed for his office. Why on earth did I agree to go out with that man? Pride. Stupid pride. I couldn't let him see that he was getting to me. Idiot, thought James. As promised, Vince had been in early and had left a list of stockholders on James's desk. James ticked off all the stockholders with holdings greater than 1%. There were 21. He recognised 5 large pension funds and crossed them off immediately. He found another 8 insurance companies and 3 fund managers on the net and crossed them off. That left just 5 unknowns. 2 were UK-based companies, and he knew he'd be able to check their legitimacy within a few hours. The remaining 3 were offshore concerns. He wrote down their names on his notepad and circled them. It was not unusual to find offshore companies on a list of stockholders, but it gave James a starting point and something to watch. "Morning, Jimbo," said Vince, popping his head around the door of James's office. James looked up. "Good morning, Vinny," and smiled. "Read the news this morning, James?" said Vince, unfazed. "Haven't had time yet." "Tell me the good news," replied James. "How do you know it is good news?" asked Vince, looking forlorn. "Because you had a grin the size of a Halloween pumpkin when you first poked your head around my door," said James knowingly. "Well, you're right, Jimbo. We lost less than 1% on opening prices, and the stock price has fully recovered as of 10 minutes ago," said Vince, unable to contain his happiness. "Let's hope it's not a temporary reprieve," said James, looking down at his list of stockholders. "Goddamn accountants," said Vince, laughing. "Hey, Vince, before you go, any idea who those companies belong to?" Vince walked to James's desk, and James handed Vince his list of companies. "Just one," replied Vince. "Which one?" asked James. "This one. Sapphire Investments Limited," said Vince. "How so?" asked James. "It's mine. Well, not quite true. It's mine with 3 other foreign investors, all friends of mine. I'm not breaking any rules. My holding is listed," said Vince openly. "Great. That narrows things down a bit. Vince, can you get someone to keep an eye on these companies? Make sure their holdings don't change over the next few days. I'll find out about the UK companies later on today." James wrote the 2 remaining offshore companies down for Vince as he was talking and handed them over. "Thanks, James. I'll keep you informed." Vince turned to leave. "One more thing, Vince. Do you know where Caesar's is?" "Sounds like a nightclub to me." "No idea, Jimbo. None at all." Vince grinned and raised his eyebrows as he left. James phoned Miles and asked him whether he would like to come to Caesar's with him. Miles was reticent, as he was unsure how busy Riley's would be, but called James back later to say that Tate would cover for him, unless the bar got really busy. The remainder of the day was quiet. Angela turned up at lunchtime and was too busy to talk, so James left a note letting her know that he'd be out with Miles that night. She could reach him on his mobile if she wanted him for anything. The two UK companies turned out to be legitimate fund managing operations. All James could do now was wait for the arrival of Greg Anderton, the computer guru. James arrived at Raleigh's at 8 p.m. Miles was still behind the bar and totally unprepared for his excursion with James. The bar was quiet compared to the weekend. Nevertheless, there were still 30 to 40 people, either sitting down eating or drinking. "I've only got to change my shirt and shoes," said Miles. 5 seconds and I'll be with you." 5 seconds were 15 minutes in reality. "Musician's time," muttered James as he paced the bar. "So what's this all about?" asked Miles. "How do you mean?" replied James quizzically. "Well, you and nightclubs don't exactly go hand in hand," said Miles. "It's a long story. There's a guy at work, John. I'm not sure about him, and he put me in a corner earlier today, so I agreed to see him tonight." "I need to know more about him on 2 fronts," said James. "How so?" asked Miles. "Firstly, I want to know more about him. I find him, I don't know. You tell me when you meet him. And secondly, there seems to be something going on with Angela and him," replied James, deep in thought. "Ah, that's more like it. I knew Angela would come to this at some point," said Miles, grinning, and continued. "How is the lovely Angela, anyway?" "She's good. She stayed over last night. Went a little strange on me, refused to stay, decided to stay, and was gone in the morning, leaving a short note," said James, his thoughts focusing on Angela. "Normal Angela, then," said Miles glibly. "Miles, please don't wind me up. Meeting John is bad enough. I'll tell you one thing, though." "What's that?" replied Miles, trying to be serious. "If the Angela who behaves like an angel remained like an angel for even 50% of the time, we'd be together forever." "You've no idea how good it gets," said James thoughtfully, and added, "In truth, I'll take her as she is." "Good God, man, you're a true romantic," said Miles in his best English voice, laughing. "Changing the subject, Miles, can you do me a favour and watch this guy tonight? In fact, watch everything." "What do you expect me to see?" asked Miles seriously. "I don't know. Just keep your eyes open," replied James. They arrived at Caesar's 5 minutes late. James wasn't happy. "This is the sort of place you should have," said James, surveying the queue of people waiting to be allowed in. "I'd like the money, but not the work," said Miles ruefully. James was wondering how they would get in when John appeared at the entrance and beckoned them over. He smiled and held out an overturned hand to greet the two friends. James took John's hand and shook it, and in doing so returned John's hand to the upright position. He disliked men who use a handshake to dominate their counterpart. James introduced Miles to John. "You're English. How does it feel being with your better half, us being cousins and all that?" said John, glancing at Miles and adding glibly, "Don't look so wounded. The war finished over 200 years ago. We won, but we won't hold that against you." "Do you know your ancestry, John?" asked Miles, raising his eyebrows. "Scottish," replied John. "Do you realise that the Scots are Brits?" said Miles, feeling an unpleasant glow inside his stomach. "They don't feel British, and they never wanted to be," said John, unflinching. "Did you know that Britain hired mercenary armies in bygone years to fight their wars? Did you also know that a large proportion of the American forces were British?" "So who won the war, John?" "Touché," said James, knowing full well that the intervention of the French turned the tide of the American War of Independence. John ignored Miles and handed $20 to a doorman leading the three men into the nightclub. John ushered James and Miles to a quieter area of the club. "This is Rose. Lovely, isn't she?" he cooed, and added, "She and a couple of her friends will be looking after us tonight. I hope you don't mind, but I have to be with someone who's just come in. I'll be back in 5. John left and walked briskly away from the private area and disappeared. "That was brilliant, Miles. How did you know about all that mercenary stuff?" "I didn't know you were a historian," said James, smiling. "It was bullshit for an ass. I had no idea what I was talking about, but sure as hell I knew he wouldn't have a clue either." They both laughed. "Got to go to the little boys' room. See you in a mo," said Miles. Miles stepped out into the main arena and looked around for the men's cloakroom. All around the club were tall, willowy, blonde women with perfectly formed bodies. He smiled to himself. It'd been a long time since he'd been in a place like this. He made his way around the perimeter of the dance floor, where he saw John talking animatedly to a huge, bald-headed man and a smaller Latino man. He stood and watched for a moment before continuing his journey to the cloakrooms. He felt he knew these types of men and found it incongruous that a smooth-talking, slickly dressed man like John would give them the time of day. Still, there's now the strangest folk, he thought. By the time Miles had returned to the private area, John was back. The remainder of the evening passed off uneventfully. John was not inclined to tease either James or Miles once it had become obvious that the two friends were not interested in women. John proved himself to be an amusing host. He was also very generous with gratuities to anyone who served them. Even James began to think that he had read John incorrectly. They had barely discussed business, and John had been charming. James and Miles left just after midnight. "What do you think?" asked James as they shut the car doors. "He's an odd one. Sickly smooth, then charming, friendly and fun. He's got some strange friends too," said Miles, replaying what he saw earlier in his mind. "How so?" said James, referring to John's friends. "I don't know. They just didn't seem to be the types to hang around a man like John. They weren't doing anything wrong in particular, though. One looked like a gorilla, and the other looked like a dealer. That's all," replied Miles thoughtfully. "Maybe he scores from them. That would account for his mood swings," he added. "Scores?" said James. "Jesus, James, where have you been for the last 30 years? Don't you watch television or anything?" replied Miles incredulously. "I watch Monday Night Football," offered James helpfully. "Look, James, it's obvious that John does a bit of coke, and maybe he buys from those guys," said Miles. "Then why didn't you say that in the first place?" said James, frustrated with his friend's impatience. "I give up. No wonder Angela slips out in the morning. She's probably trying to avoid a conversation or something," said Miles mischievously. They pulled up outside Raleigh's, and Miles got out. "Thanks for coming," said James. "No problem. See you anon," replied Miles, glancing at the windows where he could see Tate and a couple of Raleigh's boys clearing up. "Got to go, James. See you." Miles held his hand up as he drove away, then slipped into the bar. "Hey, babe, I'm back," he called to Tate. "Come on over here, big boy, and give me a kiss," said Tate, smiling. Miles obliged. "Now take that cloth and clean the bar," said Tate seriously, then bursting into a broad grin. Miles knew he'd be a lucky man tonight. "Hi, lover," said Angela, appearing as if out of nowhere, as James stepped out of his car. James jumped as he swung round to see Angela smiling at him with that same coy look that he found so sexy. He was momentarily lost for words. "Angela, how long have you been here?" he asked. "That's no way to greet me," said Angela, putting her arms around his neck. "Shall we go in?" said James, trying to make sense of the situation. "Where's your car?" he added. "You're so romantic, James," said Angela, her hand slipping from his neck onto his chest, a frown appearing on her face. "Someone else told me that tonight," quipped James helpfully. "Have you met someone else already?" said Angela angrily, her eyes tearing into him. "No, not at all," he gushed, and added, "Mars, it was Mars. He said I was a true romantic." Angela stood and stared into James's eye, as if trying to determine whether James was telling the truth. "He's wrong," she said, taking his hand and leading him to the front door like a little boy. "He's so wrong."